The coffee shop fell silent as the handcuffs clicked shut around Sarah Mitchell's wrists. Customers stared in disbelief as the woman who had been quietly sipping her morning latte was suddenly surrounded by federal agents. Her crime? According to the charges, she had been impersonating a Navy SEAL for over 3 years, collecting veterans' benefits and speaking at military events across the country. The evidence seemed overwhelming. A female claiming to be part of an elite unit that had never officially accepted women, with no military records to back up her story. But as they led her toward the unmarked vehicle, something extraordinary happened. A decorated general who had been sitting in the corner booth slowly stood up, his eyes fixed on something most people would never notice. Sarah's calm demeanor under pressure, the way she automatically scanned the room for exits, and, most tellingly, the small tactical pen she carried, a piece of equipment so specialized that only a handful of people in the world would recognize its true significance. As the agents paused at his approach, the general leaned in close to the lead investigator and whispered 7 words that would turn this entire case upside down. Only operatives carry that particular model. What followed would expose a web of classified operations, hidden identities, and a truth so sensitive that it had been buried beneath layers of government secrecy for nearly a decade. This is the true story of the woman who couldn't prove she was telling the truth because the truth itself was classified beyond her security clearance to reveal. Sarah Mitchell had always been good at blending in. At 34, she worked as a freelance security consultant in Denver, Colorado, living in a modest apartment downtown, and maintaining the kind of unremarkable routine that made neighbors forget she existed. Every morning at 6, she would run the same 5-mile loop through the city park. Every Tuesday, she volunteered at the local Veterans Center. Every Friday, she treated herself to coffee and a newspaper at Brewster's, the small cafe on 5th Street where she had become such a regular that the staff knew her order by heart. To anyone watching, Sarah was simply another professional trying to make it in the world. She dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and had the kind of forgettable face that people struggled to remember even after multiple conversations. Her apartment was neat, but not obsessively so, decorated with a few landscape photographs and generic furniture that could have come from any department store. She drove a reliable Honda Civic, paid her bills on time, and had never so much as received a parking ticket. But beneath this carefully constructed, ordinary life lay secrets that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. The morning runs weren't just for fitness. They were tactical reconnaissance, mapping escape routes, and identifying potential threats in her neighborhood. The volunteer work at the Veterans Center wasn't purely altruistic. It was intelligence gathering, staying connected to a community that might provide crucial information or assistance if needed. Even her choice of coffee shop had been deliberate, selected for its multiple exits, clear sight lines, and location at the intersection of 3 major roads. The truth was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't really Sarah Mitchell at all. That identity had been carefully crafted by professionals 6 years earlier, complete with a backstory, employment history, and social security number that would pass all but the most intensive government scrutiny. Her real name was classified at levels that existed in only the most sensitive corners of the intelligence community, and the work she had done before becoming Sarah Mitchell was the kind that officially never happened. For 3 years, this double life had worked perfectly. She maintained her cover while slowly reintegrating into civilian society, following protocols that had been drilled into her during months of debriefing after a final mission. The plan was simple: live quietly, maintain minimal contact with her previous life, and wait for the official all-clear that would allow her to either resume her real identity or make the Sarah Mitchell persona permanent. The first crack in her carefully maintained facade came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Sarah was leaving the Veterans Center after her weekly volunteer shift when she noticed Marcus Webb in the parking lot. Marcus was a former Army Ranger who had lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan, and he regularly attended the support group meetings that Sarah helped facilitate. He was a good man, honest, and straightforward, who had been working hard to rebuild his life after his injury. But On that particular Tuesday, Marcus looked troubled. He approached Sarah hesitantly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard before speaking in a low voice that immediately put her on alert. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Some of the guys have been talking, and there are things about your story that don't quite add up." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her calm exterior. "What do you mean? You've mentioned serving overseas, but you're always vague about the details. You know too much about certain operations for someone who claims they were just in logistics support. And yesterday, when that new guy was having a panic attack during group therapy, the way you handled it." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "That wasn't standard first aid training. That was something else entirely. The panic attack incident had been a calculated risk. James Morrison, a young Marine veteran, had suffered a severe episode during group therapy, becoming violent and disoriented as traumatic memories overwhelmed him. While other volunteers struggled to restrain him safely, Sarah had moved with precision and efficiency that came from extensive training in dealing with combat stress reactions. She had identified the specific triggers, neutralized the physical threat without causing harm, and guided James back to stability using techniques that weren't taught in civilian settings. Sarah had hoped no one would notice the professional nature of her response, but she had underestimated the observational skills of men who had served in combat themselves. Marcus and several other veterans had recognized something in her movements and knowledge that went far beyond what any civilian volunteer should possess. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Sarah said carefully, but she could see in Marcus's eyes that her deflection wasn't working. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble," Marcus continued, "but some of the younger guys are starting to ask questions. They think you might be one of those stolen valor cases, someone pretending to have served when they didn't. I don't believe that, but I also don't think you're telling us the whole truth about your background." The stolen valor accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The idea that genuine veterans might think she was disrespecting their service by fabricating military experience was exactly the kind of situation her handlers had warned her about during debriefing. The irony was devastating. She had served her country in ways that went far beyond what most people could imagine, but she couldn't defend herself without revealing classified information that could endanger ongoing operations. "Marcus, I understand your concern," she said, maintaining eye contact despite her growing anxiety. "My service record is complicated, and there are aspects I can't discuss for legal reasons. I hope you can respect that." It was the truth, as far as she could tell it, but she could see that it wasn't enough for Marcus. His expression remained troubled as he nodded slowly and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the parking lot with the growing realization that her carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel. Over the following weeks, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how she was treated at the Veterans Center. Conversations would stop when she entered rooms. People who had been warm and welcoming became politely distant. The easy camaraderie that had developed over months of volunteer work began to evaporate, replaced by suspicious glances and whispered discussions that ended whenever she approached. The situation came to a head during a Memorial Day ceremony at the local Veterans Memorial Park. Sarah had been invited to speak about the importance of supporting returning veterans, a role she had filled several times before without incident. But as she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included not just veterans, but active duty military personnel and their families, she realized that someone had been investigating her background more thoroughly than she had anticipated. In the third row, she spotted Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, a woman she recognized from intelligence briefings years earlier. Hayes was now stationed at nearby Peterson Air Force Base, and her presence at a routine community event was far from coincidental. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Sarah saw a flicker of recognition that sent cold fear racing through her veins. Sarah delivered her speech flawlessly, drawing on genuine experiences and emotions while carefully avoiding any specific details that might contradict her cover story. She spoke about the challenges of reintegration, the importance of mental health support, and the need for communities to welcome veterans home with understanding rather than judgment. The words resonated with her audience, earning genuine applause and several emotional responses from veterans in attendance. But as she stepped down from the podium, Sarah knew that her time as Sarah Mitchell was coming to an end. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was waiting by the memorial wall, studying the names engraved in black granite with an intensity that seemed casual, but which Sarah recognized as professional surveillance technique. "Powerful speech," Hayes said without turning around as Sarah approached. "Very authentic. The kind of authenticity that comes from real experience." "Thank you," Sarah replied, positioning herself so she could monitor the entire area while appearing to simply admire the memorial. "It's interesting how some experiences can't be shared publicly," Hayes continued, finally turning to face Sarah directly. "Classification levels, national security concerns, that sort of thing, makes it difficult for people to understand the full scope of someone's service." The conversation was loaded with meaning that would be invisible to casual observers, but was crystal clear to both women. Hayes knew exactly who Sarah was, or at least knew enough to recognize that there was more to her story than appeared in any official records. The question was whether this knowledge represented a threat or an opportunity. "Some stories are better left untold," Sarah said carefully. "For everyone's safety." "Agreed," Hayes nodded. "But sometimes circumstances force those stories into the open. Sometimes people start asking questions that can't be answered without revealing things that should remain hidden." Before Sarah could respond, Hayes handed her a business card with nothing on it except a phone number written in pencil. "If you ever need someone who understands the complexity of service records that don't exist," she said quietly, "that number reaches someone who might be able to help." Hayes walked away without another word, leaving Sarah alone with the growing certainty that her situation was more precarious than she had realized. Someone was clearly investigating her background, and the questions were getting closer to truths that couldn't be revealed without compromising classified operations that might still be ongoing. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing her options. She could contact her former handlers and request immediate extraction, abandoning the Sarah Mitchell identity and disappearing into another cover life. She could try to weather the storm, hoping that the questions would die down without triggering a formal investigation. Or she could take the risk of reaching out to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, gambling that military intelligence might provide protection that her former agency couldn't or wouldn't offer. As she weighed these choices, Sarah had no way of knowing that the decision was about to be taken out of her hands entirely. Across town, a complaint had already been filed with the FBI's Stolen Valor Task Force, alleging that Sarah Mitchell had been fraudulently claiming military service and collecting veterans' benefits under false pretenses. The complaint included detailed observations about her behavior, statements she had made during volunteer work, and inconsistencies in her story that suggested a pattern of deception. The investigation that would ultimately lead to her arrest had already begun, set in motion by the very people she had been trying to help. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., classified files were being quietly pulled and reviewed by people who understood that Sarah Mitchell's case was far more complicated than anyone at the local level could possibly imagine. The careful balance she had maintained for 3 years was about to collapse entirely, but the most dangerous part of her story was just beginning. Special Agent Rebecca Chun had seen her share of stolen valor cases during her 5 years with the FBI's fraud division, but the Sarah Mitchell file landed on her desk with unusual urgency. The initial complaint had come through regular channels. A group of concerned veterans had reported suspicious behavior from a woman claiming military service, but by the time Chun received the case, it had been flagged by multiple agencies and marked for priority investigation. The complainant was Marcus Webb, the former Army Ranger who had first questioned Sarah's background. His formal statement was detailed and professional, written with the precision of someone who understood the seriousness of the allegations. Webb described months of interactions with Sarah Mitchell during volunteer work at the Denver Veterans Center, cataloging inconsistencies in her story and behavior that had raised red flags among the veteran community. According to Webb's statement, Sarah claimed to have served in logistic support roles during overseas deployments, but demonstrated knowledge and skills that suggested much more extensive military training. She knew classified details about specific operations that shouldn't have been accessible to support personnel. Her responses to emergency situations showed professional-level combat medical training. Most troubling, she had been collecting veterans' disability benefits for service-connected injuries that didn't appear in any accessible military records. Chun began her investigation with the standard database searches that typically resolved stolen valor cases within hours. Military personnel records, deployment histories, medical files, and benefit claims were all searchable through interconnected government systems that made fraud detection relatively straightforward. But when Chun entered Sarah Mitchell's information into these databases, she encountered something she had never seen before: a complete absence of data coupled with security warnings that appeared whenever she tried to access certain fields. The warnings were vague, but ominous. Classification level insufficient for access. Contact supervising authority before proceeding. Case may involve ongoing operations. These were not the typical responses for someone who had never served in the military. Chun had investigated hundreds of fraudulent military claims, and she knew the difference between someone who had never been in the system and someone whose records had been deliberately obscured. Chen's first step was to contact the Department of Defense Personnel Office directly. She spoke with Sergeant Major Patricia Vasquez, a career administrator who had been processing military records for over 20 years. Vasquez was initially helpful, running searches through multiple databases and cross-referencing various record systems. But when they reached Sarah Mitchell's file, Vasquez's tone changed dramatically. "Agent Chun, I'm going to need you to hold while I speak with my supervisor," Vasquez said after a long pause. "There are some complications with this particular case that require higher-level authorization." The hold lasted nearly 30 minutes. When Vasquez returned to the line, she sounded cautious and somewhat confused. "Agent Chun, I've been instructed to refer you to a different office for this particular inquiry. I'm going to transfer you to someone who can better assist with your investigation." The transfer connected Chun to a number she didn't recognize, answered by a man who identified himself only as Mr. Rodriguez and claimed to work for personnel security. His voice was professional but guarded, and he seemed to know details about her investigation that she hadn't shared with anyone. "Agent Chun, we understand you're investigating Sarah Mitchell for potential fraud related to military service claims. We appreciate your thoroughness, but this case involves complexities that require careful handling. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation in person." Chun was immediately suspicious. In her experience, legitimate military personnel offices didn't arrange mysterious meetings or speak in vague terms about complexities. This sounded more like the kind of interference she encountered when investigations touched on classified or sensitive matters. But it also suggested that Sarah Mitchell might be exactly what the complainant suspected: someone with no legitimate claim to military service who had somehow created a convincing false identity. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a downtown office building that Chun recognized as housing several federal agencies. Mr. Rodriguez met her in the lobby, a middle-aged man in a conservative suit who looked like any other government bureaucrat. He escorted her to a small conference room on the 14th floor, where she was surprised to find two other people waiting: a woman in navy dress uniform with captain stripes, and a man in civilian clothes who had the bearing and haircut of military or law enforcement. "Agent Chun," Rodriguez began after introductions were made, "we've asked you here because the Sarah Mitchell case intersects with matters of national security that complicate your fraud investigation. Captain Morrison here represents Naval Special Warfare Command, and Mr. Patterson works with intelligence oversight. We need to discuss how to proceed without compromising ongoing operations." Chun felt her detective instincts sharpening. "Are you telling me that Sarah Mitchell is actually military personnel operating undercover?" The three officials exchanged glances before Captain Morrison answered. "We can't confirm or deny the specifics of any individual service record, but We can tell you that your investigation has the potential to expose classified operations that are still active. We need to find a way to resolve the fraud allegations without creating national security issues. That's convenient, Chin said dryly. Every time I investigate someone with no military records, they turn out to be super secret special forces. Do you have any actual evidence that Sarah Mitchell served in any capacity, or is this just another attempt to cover up stolen valor? Mr. Patterson leaned forward. Agent Shun, we understand your skepticism. You deal with fraudulent claims constantly, and we respect your expertise. But consider this. If Sarah Mitchell were simply a civilian pretending to be military, would we be having this conversation? Would multiple agencies be involved in what should be a straightforward fraud case? It was a fair point, but Chen remained unconvinced. If she's legitimate military, then produce the records. If her service is classified, then there should still be basic documentation of her existence in the system. Every person who's ever served leaves some kind of paper trail, even if the details are redacted. That's not always true, Captain Morrison said carefully. There are programs, particularly in special operations and intelligence, where individuals operate under such deep cover that their true identities are compartmentalized beyond normal security classifications. Sometimes the only way to confirm their legitimacy is through channels that would compromise the very operations we're trying to protect. Chun studied the three officials, trying to read between the lines of their carefully worded statements. Either Sarah Mitchell was involved in something so classified that even the FBI couldn't be given access to her real records, or these people were part of an elaborate cover-up designed to protect someone who had committed serious fraud. Both possibilities seemed equally unlikely. What exactly are you asking me to do? Chen asked. Continue your investigation, Rodriguez answered. But do it carefully. If you find evidence of actual fraud, fake documents, false claims, deliberate deception, then proceed with charges. But if the only issue is missing records or inconsistencies that might be explained by classification, consider the possibility that you're dealing with something beyond typical stolen valor. Chun left the meeting more confused than when she arrived. The officials had given her enough information to suggest that Sarah Mitchell's case was genuinely complex, but not enough to determine whether that complexity was legitimate or simply sophisticated fraud. She decided to approach the investigation from a different angle, focusing on Sarah's current activities rather than her mysterious past. Over the next 2 weeks, Chun conducted surveillance of Sarah's daily routine, looking for behavior that might indicate fraud or deception. She watched Sarah's morning runs, noting the tactical awareness that several complainants had mentioned. She observed her interactions at the Veterans Center, where Sarah demonstrated knowledge and skills that seemed genuine but couldn't be verified through official channels. She reviewed Sarah's financial records, finding modest income from legitimate security consulting work and veterans' disability payments that were substantial but not excessive. The disability payments were particularly interesting. Sarah was receiving compensation for service-connected PTSD and chronic pain related to an injury sustained during overseas deployment. The medical records supporting these claims were authentic and detailed, describing symptoms and treatment that aligned with genuine combat trauma. But the treating physicians were all affiliated with military medical facilities, and their notes referenced service records that Chin couldn't access. Chin also discovered that Sarah had been quietly involved in veteran outreach beyond her formal volunteer work. She had helped several struggling veterans find employment, provided financial assistance to families facing eviction, and served as an informal counselor for people dealing with severe PTSD. These activities weren't publicized and didn't appear to serve any purpose other than genuine desire to help fellow veterans. The break in Chin's investigation came when she decided to interview Sarah directly. Rather than attempting a formal interrogation that might trigger legal proceedings, Chin chose to approach Sarah at the coffee shop where she spent Friday mornings. She positioned herself at a nearby table and observed Sarah's behavior for nearly an hour before making contact. Sarah was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee, appearing relaxed and comfortable in her environment. But Chen noticed several details that confirmed the reports about her tactical awareness. Sarah had chosen a seat that provided clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. She periodically scanned the room without appearing to do so, using her peripheral vision and reflective surfaces to monitor other customers. When someone new entered the cafe, Sarah automatically assessed them as potential threats before returning to her reading. Most telling was Sarah's reaction when Chun finally approached her table. Before Chun had said a word or shown her badge, Sarah's posture changed slightly. Her muscles tensed, her breathing became more controlled, and her eyes focused with the kind of intensity that Chun associated with trained law enforcement or military personnel. Sarah somehow knew that Chun represented a threat before any threat had been revealed. "Sarah Mitchell," Chun said, showing her FBI credentials. "I'm Special Agent Rebecca, Chun. I'd like to speak with you about some allegations that have been made regarding your military service." Sarah's response was immediate and telling. She didn't appear surprised or confused, the typical reactions of innocent people confronted by federal agents. Instead, she seemed resigned, as if she had been expecting this moment. "What specific allegations?" she asked calmly. "Several veterans have filed complaints suggesting that you've been misrepresenting your military background and fraudulently claiming benefits. They believe you may have never served in the armed forces." Chen watched Sarah's face carefully for any sign of deception or guilt. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and precise. "Agent Chun, I understand why those complaints were filed. I also understand that my situation is complicated in ways that make it difficult to provide the kind of documentation people expect. But I want you to know that I have never claimed benefits or recognition that I wasn't entitled to receive." It was exactly the kind of non-answer that Chen expected from someone trying to avoid admitting fraud, but there was something in Sarah's tone that gave her pause. Sarah wasn't defensive or evasive in the way that guilty people typically were. Instead, she seemed genuinely frustrated by her inability to provide more complete answers. "If you served legitimately, then there should be records," Chun said. "Every person who's ever been in the military leaves a paper trail, even if some details are classified. Can you provide any documentation of your service?" Sarah hesitated again before answering. "Agent Chun, I wish I could give you the simple answers you're looking for, but there are legal restrictions on what information I can share about my background. I've been advised by counsel that certain details about my service could compromise national security if disclosed improperly." Chen had heard similar claims before from people trying to cover up stolen valor, but Sarah's mention of legal counsel was interesting. "What counsel?" she asked. "Government attorneys," Sarah answered. "People who understand the classification issues involved in my case." This was new information that Chun hadn't encountered in previous stolen valor investigations. She made note of it for follow-up research while continuing to press for concrete details. "Can you at least tell me what branch of service you were in? What years you served? Basic information that wouldn't compromise any operations." Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I served in multiple capacities between 2010 and 2019. Some of that service was with conventional military units. Some was with specialized organizations that operated under different authorities. The details of my assignments and the units I worked with are classified at levels that prevent me from discussing them without authorization from people who are much higher up the chain of command than either of us." Chen made detailed notes of Sarah's responses while evaluating her body language and vocal patterns for signs of deception. Everything about Sarah's demeanor suggested that she was telling the truth as she understood it, but the vagueness of her answers made verification impossible. Either she was an exceptionally skilled liar, or she was genuinely constrained by classification restrictions that prevented her from providing the documentation she needed. The interview continued for another hour, with Chun pressing for specific details and Sarah providing careful responses that revealed nothing concrete about her background. By the end of their conversation, Chun was more convinced than ever that Sarah Mitchell was hiding something significant. The question was whether she was hiding evidence of fraud or evidence of legitimate service that couldn't be disclosed through normal channels. As Chun prepared to leave, she decided to make one final attempt to get useful information. "Sarah, I want you to understand that these allegations are serious. If you're guilty of stolen valor, you could face significant federal charges. But if you're innocent and simply can't prove it through normal channels, then you need to help me understand how to verify your legitimacy without compromising whatever classified operations you claim to have been involved in." Sarah's response would stay with Chun for weeks to come. "Agent Chun, I hope you never find yourself in a position where the truth becomes a liability rather than a protection. I serve my country faithfully, and I've never claimed anything I wasn't entitled to claim. But the nature of that service makes it impossible for me to defend myself in the way that normal people can. All I can do is hope that the investigation will be thorough enough to reveal the truth, whatever the consequences might be." It was a response that could have been calculated to evoke sympathy, but Chin detected no manipulation in Sarah's voice or expression. If anything, Sarah seemed genuinely sad about her situation, frustrated by her inability to clear her name through simple documentation. Chun left the coffee shop with more questions and answers, and a growing suspicion that the Sarah Mitchell case was about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Following her interview with Sarah Mitchell, Agent Chen intensified her investigation using resources that went beyond standard fraud detection protocols. The vague warnings from federal officials about national security complications had made her more determined rather than more cautious. In her experience, people who invoke classification and national security were usually trying to hide something, and she was prepared to dig deeper to discover what that something might be. Chen's first breakthrough came when she accessed Sarah's credit card records through a federal warrant. The purchase history revealed patterns that painted a complex picture of someone living two distinct lives simultaneously. Alongside ordinary civilian expenses like groceries, utilities, and coffee shop visits, there were purchases that suggested ongoing connections to military or law enforcement communities that didn't align with Sarah's cover story. In the past 18 months alone, Sarah had purchased specialized tactical gear from suppliers that primarily served law enforcement and military customers. Night vision equipment, encrypted communication devices, high-end surveillance equipment, and medical supplies that went far beyond basic first aid kits. She had also made regular payments to a private security firm in Virginia that Chun discovered provided consulting services to government agencies and defense contractors. More intriguing were travel expenses that revealed a pattern of trips that seemed unrelated to Sarah's stated work as a freelance security consultant. Over the past 3 years, she had traveled to Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, California, and Fort Bragg, North Carolina at regular intervals. The trips were always brief, usually 3 to 4 days, and always paid for in cash after airline tickets were purchased with credit cards. Hotel records showed that she stayed in modest accommodations, but always requested rooms on upper floors with multiple exit routes. Chun cross-referenced these travel dates with her interviews of veterans who had filed complaints about Sarah's behavior. Several witnesses reported that Sarah would disappear for days at a time, offering minimal explanation for her absences. When she returned, she often seemed more alert and focused, as if she had received briefings or training that refreshed skills that might otherwise have deteriorated through disuse. The most revealing discovery came when Chin obtained Sarah's cell phone records through a second federal warrant. The data showed a complex pattern of communications that contradicted the image of a simple civilian living quietly in Denver. Sarah maintained multiple phone numbers, including encrypted lines that connected to government agencies Chin couldn't immediately identify. She received calls from numbers registered to the Pentagon, Langley, Virginia, and various military installations across the country. The timing of these calls was particularly significant. They often preceded Sarah's mysterious trips or followed incidents where her behavior had raised questions among local veterans. It appeared that someone was monitoring her situation closely and providing guidance about how to handle complications that arose from her cover identity. Chun decided to trace one of the frequently called numbers, which led her through a maze of forwarding services and encrypted routing systems before connecting to an office that identified itself only as Administrative Services Division. When Chen attempted to make inquiries about Sarah Mitchell, she was told that no information could be provided without proper authorization codes and that all requests needed to be submitted through official channels. The administrative runaround was familiar to Chun from previous cases involving classified government operations, but it also raised new questions about the scope of whatever Sarah was involved in. If she was simply a fraud case, why would government agencies be protecting her communications? If she was legitimate military personnel, why wasn't there some way to verify her credentials without compromising operational security? Chen's investigation took an unexpected turn when she decided to interview Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the psychiatrist who had been treating Sarah for service-connected PTSD. Dr. Reyes practiced at a Veterans Administration Medical Center and had extensive experience treating combat trauma in returning veterans. She was initially reluctant to discuss Sarah's case due to patient confidentiality, but Chen's federal warrant compelled her to provide relevant information about Sarah's disability claims. Sarah Mitchell presents a complex case, Dr. Reyes explained during their meeting in her office at the VA Medical Center. Her symptoms are consistent with severe combat trauma, but the circumstances that cause that trauma are unusual in ways that affect treatment planning. What do you mean by unusual? Chen asked. Dr. Reyes consulted her notes before answering carefully. Most of my patients experience trauma during conventional military deployments where they were part of larger units with clear command structures and mission parameters. Sarah's trauma appears to stem from situations where she was operating independently or with very small teams, often in circumstances where normal military support systems weren't available. Can you be more specific? Her PTSD symptoms include hypervigilance that goes beyond typical combat stress responses. She demonstrates survival instincts that suggest prolonged exposure to environments where trusted allies were rare and threats could come from any direction, including from people who should have been on the same side. She also shows signs of moral injury related to decisions she was forced to make without adequate support or guidance from superiors. Dr. Reyes paused to consider her next words. Agent Chun, I've treated hundreds of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, including Special Forces personnel who operated in dangerous conditions. Sarah's psychological profile is consistent with someone who spent extended periods in deep cover situations where discovery would have meant death, not just for her, but potentially for other operatives and civilian assets. This was the most specific information Chan had obtained about the nature of Sarah's alleged service, and it painted a picture that was difficult to reconcile with stolen valor fraud. People who fabricated military service typically claimed heroic but conventional roles that would be impressive to civilian audiences. They didn't usually create elaborate psychological profiles involving deep cover operations and moral injury from classified decision-making. Has Sarah ever described specific operations or locations where she served? Chen asked. No, and that's actually part of what makes her case unusual, Dr. Reyes replied. Most veterans with PTSD need to process their trauma by discussing the events that caused it, even in general terms. Sarah has been unable or unwilling to provide any details about the situations that traumatized her. She speaks in abstract terms about difficult decisions and impossible situations without ever describing what those decisions involved or where those situations occurred. Could that indicate that she's making up her trauma? People who haven't actually experienced combat might have difficulty providing convincing details. Dr. Reyes shook her head firmly. Sarah's symptoms are too sophisticated and consistent for fabrication. PTSD involves specific neurological and psychological responses that can't be convincingly faked over extended periods. Her sleep patterns, startle responses, avoidance behaviors, and cognitive processing all show signs of genuine trauma. Whatever caused her current condition, it was real and severe. Chun left the VA Medical Center with more evidence that Sarah's military service might be legitimate, but she still lacked the concrete documentation needed to close her investigation conclusively. She decided to focus on the veterans' disability benefits that Sarah was receiving, reasoning that fraudulent benefit claims would leave paper trails that might be easier to verify than service records. The disability payments were processed through the Department of Veterans Affairs based on medical evaluations and service record documentation that Chun still couldn't access directly. But she could examine the financial aspects of the claims to determine whether the amounts Sarah received were consistent with legitimate entitlements or suggested fraudulent inflation. Sarah was receiving monthly disability payments of approximately $3,100, which corresponded to a 70% disability rating for combined physical and psychological conditions. The rating was based on documented PTSD, chronic pain from an unspecified injury sustained during overseas deployment, and hearing loss consistent with prolonged exposure to loud noises such as gunfire or explosions. Chun consulted with VA benefit specialists to understand how these ratings would have been calculated. The process required extensive medical documentation, independent examinations by VA physicians, and verification of service-connected causes for each claim condition. The specialists confirmed that Sarah's disability rating was consistent with someone who had experienced significant combat trauma, but they also noted that the supporting documentation had been processed through unusual channels that suggested elevated security classifications. Typically, we can trace the complete history of a veteran's disability claim from initial filing through final determination, explained Janet Morrison, a senior VA benefit specialist. But some of the documentation supporting MS. Mitchell's claim came through restricted channels that limit our access to the underlying records. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that someone with very high security clearance authenticated her service-connected injuries without providing the detailed operational reports that we usually require. That level of authentication is reserved for cases involving classified operations where standard documentation would compromise national security. Chun was beginning to see a pattern emerging from her investigation. Every attempt to verify Sarah's military service led to evidence suggesting that her service was real, but classified at levels that prevented normal verification procedures. Either Sarah Mitchell was the victim of an extraordinary conspiracy involving multiple government agencies, or she was someone whose legitimate service couldn't be documented through conventional channels. Chun decided to test this theory by arranging for Sarah's arrest on preliminary fraud charges. If Sarah's claims about classification restrictions were legitimate, then charging her would likely trigger intervention from whatever agencies were protecting her records. If her claims were fraudulent, then the arrest might pressure her into admitting the truth about her fabricated background. The arrest was planned for a Friday morning at Brewster's Cafe, Sarah's regular coffee destination. Chun coordinated with local Denver FBI agents to ensure that the arrest would be public enough to send a clear message about the seriousness of the charges, but controlled enough to avoid unnecessary publicity that might complicate any legitimate classification issues. On the morning of the arrest, Chun positioned herself in the cafe early to observe Sarah's arrival and behavior. Sarah appeared at her usual time, ordered her standard coffee and newspaper, and settled into her customary seat near the window. She seemed relaxed and unaware that federal agents were preparing to take her into custody. But as the arrest team moved into position, Chun noticed something that gave her pause. Sarah's demeanor changed subtly several minutes before the agents revealed themselves. Her posture became more alert. Her eyes began scanning the room more systematically, and she shifted her position to improve her sight lines to all exits. It was as if she had detected surveillance through methods that weren't apparent to trained federal agents. When the agents finally approached Sarah's table with handcuffs ready, her reaction was immediately telling. She didn't resist or demand explanations like typical civilians would. Instead, she calmly set down her coffee, placed her hands on the table in plain sight, and waited for instructions. Her body language suggested familiarity with arrest procedures and professional respect for the agent's authority. Sarah Mitchell, You're under arrest for violations of federal laws regarding fraudulent military service claims, Agent Chun announced formally. You have the right to remain silent. As Chun read the Miranda warning, she watched Sarah's face for any sign of fear, anger, or surprise that might indicate guilt or innocence. But Sarah's expression remained neutral and controlled, showing neither the panic of someone caught in a lie nor the indignation of someone falsely accused. If anything, she seemed resigned to the arrest, as if it were an inevitable consequence of circumstances beyond her control. The arrest proceeded without incident until an unexpected interruption occurred. As the agents prepared to escort Sarah from the cafe, an elderly man in a military dress uniform approached their group. Chen initially assumed he was a concerned citizen reacting to the public arrest, but his calm authority and direct approach suggested something more significant. The man was General William Harrison, recently retired from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and currently serving in an advisory role to the Secretary of Defense. Chen recognized him from news coverage of military affairs, but his presence at a routine arrest in Denver was completely inexplicable. General Harrison approached close enough to observe Sarah directly, and Chen noticed that his attention seemed focused on specific details that weren't obvious to other observers. General Harrison studied Sarah's bearing under pressure, her automatic tactical positioning even while handcuffed, and, most intriguingly, the small black tactical pen that she carried clipped to her shirt pocket. The pen appeared ordinary to Chun, but General Harrison's reaction suggested that he recognized something significant about it that others had missed. After several minutes of silent observation, General Harrison approached Agent Chun and requested a private word. Agent Chun, I believe there may be complications with this arrest that haven't been properly communicated to your investigation team. I'd like to suggest that we pause these proceedings pending a more thorough review of the classified aspects of this case. Chen was immediately suspicious of the general's intervention, but his obvious authority and the legitimate nature of his military credentials made it difficult to simply ignore his concerns. General Harrison, what specific information do you have about Sarah Mitchell that would affect our fraud investigation? General Harrison glanced at Sarah again before answering carefully. Agent Chun, some aspects of military service are documented in ways that aren't accessible through normal investigative channels. I'd like to suggest that we continue this conversation in a more secure environment where sensitive information can be properly discussed. As Chun weighed her options, she realized that the Sarah Mitchell case had just become far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The intervention of a general officer at the moment of arrest suggested that there were indeed national security implications that went beyond simple stolen valor fraud. But it also raised the possibility that Sarah's entire story was an elaborate deception that had somehow convinced even high-ranking military officials. The arrest would proceed as planned, but Chen knew that the Real investigation was just beginning. Whatever truth lay behind Sarah Mitchell's identity, it was about to be revealed in ways that would challenge everything Chun thought she knew about military service, classified operations, and the complicated relationship between national security and individual identity. General William Harrison had not planned to be in Denver that Friday morning, much less to witness the arrest of someone whose true identity was known to fewer than 20 people in the entire United States government. His presence at Brewster's Cafe was the result of a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation that had been monitoring Sarah Mitchell's situation for months, waiting for exactly this kind of crisis that would force classified truths into the open. 3 hours earlier, Harrison had received an encrypted call at his temporary quarters in Colorado Springs, where he was conducting routine inspections at the Air Force Academy. The caller was Admiral Janet Reynolds, director of the Joint Special Operations Command, and her message was urgent and specific. Bill, Nightingale is about to be compromised. The FBI is moving to arrest her this morning in Denver, and we need immediate intervention to prevent a catastrophic breach of operational security. Nightingale was the operational code name for Sarah Mitchell, though even that designation was known only to a handful of intelligence officials who had been briefed on the most sensitive compartments of America's deep cover operations. General Harrison had been involved in authorizing Nightingale's deployment 6 years earlier, when she was known by her real name and operating under authorities that officially didn't exist within the structure of conventional military commands. The drive from Colorado Springs to Denver gave Harrison time to review classified files that he carried in a secure briefcase, documents that contained the truth about Sarah Mitchell's service record and the reasons why that truth had been buried under layers of classification that prevented normal verification. As he read through operational reports, medical evaluations, and psychological profiles, Harrison was reminded of why Nightingale's case represented both the best and most troubling aspects of modern intelligence operations. Sarah Mitchell's real name was Captain Maria Santos, United States Navy, assigned to a joint special operations unit that conducted missions so sensitive that even their existence was compartmentalized beyond normal security classifications. Santos had volunteered for deep cover operations in 2015, undergoing extensive training in identity construction, psychological resilience, and survival techniques that prepared her for assignments where discovery would mean certain death and potential compromise of other operatives throughout the region. Her first deployment had taken her to Syria, where she operated as a freelance journalist while gathering intelligence on terrorist networks and identifying targets for special operations strikes. For 18 months, she lived among people who would have tortured and killed her if they had discovered her true identity, building relationships with sources who provided crucial information about planned attacks against American interests and Allied forces. The psychological toll of that operation had been severe, but manageable. Santos had returned to the United States for debriefing and psychological evaluation, receiving treatment for mild PTSD symptoms while being prepared for her second assignment. The medical records that Dr. Reyes had access to reflected this early trauma, but they couldn't reveal the specific circumstances that had caused it without compromising ongoing operations in the same region. Santos's second deployment had been even more dangerous and psychologically damaging. She had been inserted into Afghanistan under deep cover as an aid worker, tasked with identifying Taliban leadership targets and mapping terrorist supply networks that conventional military intelligence couldn't penetrate. The assignment required her to build relationships with people who were simultaneously potential sources and potential threats, never knowing whether her next conversation might expose her true identity. The operation that ended Santos's deep cover career had occurred during her third year in Afghanistan. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was planning a major attack against a NATO base that housed over 800 American and Allied personnel. Santos was the only asset in position to confirm the target and timeline, but gathering that intelligence required her to attend a meeting where her cover identity would be subjected to scrutiny that might expose her as an American operative. Santos had made the decision to attend the meeting despite the risks, reasoning that the lives of 800 military personnel outweighed the danger to her own safety. Her intelligence gathering was successful, leading to a preemptive strike that eliminated the Taliban commander and prevented the planned attack. But the operation had required Santos to maintain her cover while watching the airstrike kill people she had spent months building relationships with, including civilians who had been used as human shields. The moral injury from that experience had been devastating. Santos had saved hundreds of American lives, but she had done so by betraying the trust of people who had welcomed her into their community, even if those people were ultimately her enemies. The psychological trauma from living that contradiction for months while maintaining her cover had led to the severe PTSD symptoms that eventually required her medical retirement from active operations. General Harrison had been personally involved in the decision to construct the Sarah Mitchell identity as a way of protecting Santos during her transition back to civilian life. Her deep cover operations had made her a target for remaining Taliban networks, and her knowledge of sensitive intelligence methods made her a security risk if she fell into hostile hands. The Sarah Mitchell identity provided her with legal protection while allowing her to receive medical treatment and disability benefits for her service-connected injuries. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, lasting only until threat assessments indicated that Santos could safely resume her real identity or until she could be relocated to a completely new identity in a different country. But bureaucratic complications and ongoing security concerns had extended the Sarah Mitchell cover far longer than anyone had anticipated, creating the exact kind of exposure that was now threatening to compromise her safety and reveal classified operations. As Harrison arrived at Brewster's Cafe and observed the arrest in progress, he immediately recognized the tactical implications of the situation. Agent Chin's investigation had already uncovered enough information to suggest that Sarah Mitchell was more than a simple stolen valor case. If the FBI investigation continued through normal channels, it would inevitably lead to discoveries that could compromise other deep cover operatives and reveal intelligence methods that took years to develop. But Harrison also recognized that Sarah Santos herself was in immediate physical danger. Her arrest on fraud charges would create a public record that could be accessed by hostile intelligence services who had been searching for American operatives involved in the Syrian and Afghan operations. Even if the charges were eventually dropped, the publicity from the arrest could expose Santos to retaliation from terrorist networks that considered her responsible for the deaths of their commanders. Harrison's decision to intervene at the moment of arrest was based on both national security considerations and personal responsibility to an operative who had served her country faithfully under circumstances that few people could imagine. But his intervention also created new complications that would require careful management to prevent even greater exposure of classified information. When Harrison requested a private conversation with Agent Chun, he was walking a careful line between revealing enough information to resolve the immediate crisis and protecting operational details that could compromise ongoing missions. His authority as a recently retired general officer gave him credibility with federal law enforcement, but he lacked the active security clearances that would allow him to access current threat assessments or operational status reports. Agent Chun, Harrison began as they stepped away from the arrest scene. I understand that you're investigating allegations of stolen valor fraud, but this case involves complications that go far beyond what appears in any accessible records. The person you've arrested served this country in ways that required her true identity and service record to be classified at levels that prevent normal verification. Chun studied Harrison's face carefully, looking for any sign that he might be part of an elaborate deception designed to protect someone guilty of serious fraud. General, I've heard similar claims from other officials, but no one has been able to provide any concrete evidence that Sarah Mitchell actually served in any military capacity. If her service is legitimate, there should be some way to verify that fact without compromising ongoing operations. Harrison nodded, understanding Chin's skepticism while recognizing the impossible position that classification restrictions had created. Agent Chun, let me ask you to consider the evidence you've already gathered from your investigation. Have you found any indication that Sarah Mitchell created false documents or made fraudulent claims about specific military achievements? Have you discovered any financial benefits that she received fraudulently? Chun reviewed her mental notes from weeks of investigation. No direct evidence of fraud, but also no evidence of legitimate service. Her entire military background appears to have been fabricated or classified beyond your investigative access, Harrison countered. Agent Chun, consider this. If Sarah Mitchell were simply a civilian pretending to be a veteran, would she have chosen a cover story that was so vague and difficult to verify? Wouldn't she have created documentation that would pass casual scrutiny while avoiding the kind of detailed investigation that fraud allegations typically trigger? It was a point that had occurred to Chun during her investigation. Most stolen valor cases involved people who created elaborate but verifiable stories about conventional military service. They claimed to have served in well-known units during major conflicts, often providing fake documentation that looked convincing, but could be exposed through routine database searches. Sarah Mitchell's approach had been completely different. She had consistently avoided making specific claims about her service, never provided documentation that could be easily verified or disproven, and had demonstrated knowledge and skills that seemed authentic, but couldn't be traced to any conventional military training programs. General Harrison, Chun said carefully, "Are you telling me that Sarah Mitchell is actually an active duty or retired military person operating under a false identity for national security reasons?" Harrison glanced back at Sarah, who was still in handcuffs, but listening carefully to conversations around her. "Agent Chun, what I'm telling you is that some people serve this country in ways that require them to sacrifice not just their safety, but their legal ability to prove that they served at all. Sometimes the greatest honor we can give to those people is to protect their secrets, even when that protection makes them appear guilty of crimes they never committed." Before Chin could respond, Harrison walked over to where Sarah was being held by the arrest team. He studied her face for a long moment, noting the controlled calm that she maintained despite the stress of her situation. Then, his attention focused on the tactical pin clipped to her shirt pocket, the detail that had first caught his attention when he observed the arrest. "Agent Chun," Harrison called, "may I show you something that might help clarify the situation?" Chin nodded, and Harrison pointed to the pin that Sarah carried. "That appears to be an ordinary writing instrument, but it's actually a specialized piece of equipment that's issued only to operatives working in the most sensitive intelligence assignments. The design is classified, the manufacturing is restricted to a single defense contractor, and possession is limited to people who have been specifically authorized for deep cover operations." Harrison looked directly at Chun while continuing his explanation. "Agent Chun, I've seen thousands of pieces of military equipment during my career, but I've only seen that particular model of pen carried by fewer than 50 people in the entire United States military. It's not something that can be purchased on the civilian market. It's not something that would be issued to conventional military personnel, and it's not something that someone pretending to be a veteran would even know existed." Chin studied the pen more carefully, noting details that she had previously overlooked. It appeared to be made of lightweight, but durable materials, with subtle design features that suggested functionality beyond simple writing. "What makes this pen so special?" she asked. "It contains encrypted communication capabilities, emergency signaling devices, and self-defense features that are designed for operatives who might need to send distress signals or defend themselves while maintaining their cover identities," Harrison explained. "But more importantly for your investigation, it contains authentication codes that can verify the identity and authorization level of the person carrying it." Harrison turned to Sarah directly for the first time since the arrest began. "Captain Santos, with your permission, I'd like Agent Chun to understand why your case requires special handling." The use of Sarah's real name and rank caused an immediate reaction. Her controlled composure finally cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion and stress that she had been hiding throughout the investigation and arrest. For the first time, Chin saw genuine emotion in Sarah's face as she struggled with the implications of having her true identity revealed. "General Harrison," Sarah said quietly, "you know the restrictions that apply to my situation. Revealing classified information to resolve criminal charges could create complications that are worse than the charges themselves." Harrison nodded sympathetically. "Captain Santos, I understand your concerns, but the situation has developed beyond the point where classification restrictions can protect you effectively. Agent Chin's investigation has already uncovered enough information to suggest that you're not a typical stolen valor case. The choice now is between controlled disclosure that protects ongoing operations and uncontrolled exposure that could compromise everything we've worked to protect." Chin listened to this exchange with growing realization that her stolen valor investigation had uncovered something far more significant than routine fraud. Whether Sarah Mitchell was Captain Santos or simply someone who had constructed an elaborate false identity, her case clearly involved national security implications that went beyond the FBI's normal investigative procedures. "General Harrison," Chun said, "what specific steps do you recommend to resolve this situation without compromising legitimate security concerns?" Harrison's answer would determine not just the immediate fate of Sarah Santos, but the future of deep cover operations that depended on the government's ability to protect the identities of operatives who had sacrificed everything in service to their country. The decision made in that Denver coffee shop would set precedents that could affect intelligence operations for years to come, and everyone present understood that they were participating in something that would be remembered as either a successful protection of national security or a catastrophic failure that exposed America's most sensitive intelligence capabilities. The resolution of Captain Maria Santos's case required a delicate balance between transparency and security that had never been attempted in the history of American intelligence operations. General Harrison's intervention at the Denver coffee shop had prevented an immediate catastrophe, but it had also created new complications that would require unprecedented cooperation between federal law enforcement, military intelligence, and congressional oversight committees. Within 6 hours of the arrested being halted, a secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base hosted a meeting that included Agent Shun, General Harrison, Admiral Reynolds via secure video link, 2 FBI supervisors, a Justice Department attorney, and Sarah Santos herself, now officially identified by her real name and rank. The meeting was classified at levels that required special security clearances for all participants, and the discussions that followed would ultimately reshape how the United States protected deep cover operatives who sacrificed their legal identities in service to national security. Admiral Reynolds opened the briefing by establishing the scope of the problem that Santos's exposure had created. Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with the potential compromise of intelligence operations that span 6 countries and involve the safety of 17 operatives who are currently deployed in hostile environments. Captain Santos's arrest, even though it was halted, has already created security risks that will require immediate mitigation measures. The Admiral activated a secure presentation system that displayed a world map marked with locations where Santos had operated during her career in deep cover assignments. Red markers indicated areas where her exposure could lead to identification of other American operatives. Yellow markers showed regions where ongoing operations might need to be suspended pending security assessments. Green markers represented safe zones where her exposure would have minimal impact on current intelligence gathering. Captain Santos spent 6 years operating in environments where discovery would have meant not just her death, but the compromise of intelligence networks that took decades to establish, Reynolds continued. Her transition to the Sarah Mitchell identity was designed to protect both her personal safety and operational security, but the stolen valor allegations have created exactly the kind of public exposure that we were trying to prevent. Agent Chun studied the briefing materials with growing understanding of why her investigation had encountered so many obstacles and security warnings. Admiral Reynolds, why wasn't some of this information provided to federal law enforcement when the stolen valor complaints were first filed? If we had understood the national security implications, we could have approached the investigation differently. Agent Shun, the problem is that even acknowledging Captain Santos's existence would have compromised operational security, Admiral Reynolds replied. Deep cover operatives, like Captain Santos, officially don't exist within normal military record systems. Their identities are compartmentalized at levels that prevent any documentation that could be accessed through routine investigative procedures. General Harrison added context that helped explain the impossible situation that classification restrictions had created. Agent Shun, consider the paradox that Captain Santos faced when veterans began questioning her background. She couldn't defend herself against stolen valor allegations without revealing information that would compromise ongoing operations and endanger other operatives. Her only option was to maintain her cover story and hope that the investigation would somehow resolve itself without forcing disclosure of classified information. Sarah Santos spoke for the first time since her real identity had been revealed, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been living under impossible constraints for years. Agent Shun, I want you to understand that every day for the past 3 years, I've known that helping fellow veterans through volunteer work was creating risks that could expose me to exactly this situation. But after everything I've seen and done in service to this country, abandoning other veterans was an option I could live with. Santos's statement revealed the human cost of deep cover operations that extended far beyond the immediate dangers of deployment. Even after returning to American soil, she had been trapped between her desire to help fellow veterans and the security restrictions that prevented her from proving her legitimacy to serve that community. Captain Santos, Chun said, "I need to understand something that's been troubling me throughout this investigation. If your service record is so classified that it can't be verified through normal channels, how do you prove your entitlement to veterans' benefits? How does the VA process disability claims for someone who officially doesn't exist?" The answer came from David Martinez, a Justice Department attorney who specialized in national security cases involving federal benefits. Agent Chun, there are special procedures within the Department of Veterans Affairs for processing benefits claims that involve classified service records. These cases are handled by a small unit with enhanced security clearances who can verify service and injuries without accessing the operational details that need to remain classified. Martinez activated another secure presentation that showed the paper trail of Santos's benefits claims, with identifying information redacted but procedural details visible. Captain Santos's disability claims were processed through these special channels, with medical documentation provided by military physicians who had been briefed on her actual service record. The benefits she received were legitimate and properly calculated based on verified service-connected injuries. Agent Shin reviewed the benefits documentation, noting the authentication procedures that had been followed to verify Santos's claims without compromising operational security. This process seems to have worked effectively for benefits administration. Why couldn't similar procedures have been used to verify her military service for the stolen valor investigation? Because stolen valor investigations are criminal proceedings that require different evidentiary standards than administrative benefits processing, Martinez replied. Benefits claims can be verified through internal government procedures, but criminal investigations require evidence that can be presented in open court if necessary. Captain Santos's service record contains information that could never be revealed in criminal proceedings without compromising national security. Admiral Reynolds addressed the broader implications of Santos's case for future deep cover operations. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that Captain Santos's situation represents a systemic problem that affects dozens of operatives who are currently transitioning back to civilian life. If we can't find a way to protect their legal identities while allowing them to reintegrate into society, we'll lose the ability to recruit qualified personnel for the most sensitive intelligence assignments. The Admiral's concern was well-founded. Deep cover operations required volunteers who were willing to sacrifice not just their safety, but their legal ability to prove their service to their country. If operatives couldn't trust that their identities would be protected during reintegration, the intelligence community would lose access to capabilities that were essential for national security. General Harrison proposed a solution that would address both Santos's immediate legal situation and the broader policy issues raised by her case. I recommend that we establish a formal legal framework for protecting the identities of deep cover operatives who face civilian criminal investigations. This would involve creating special procedures within the Justice Department for verifying classified service records without compromising operational security. The proposal would require congressional authorization and coordination between multiple federal agencies, but it offered a path toward resolving Santos's case while preventing similar problems in the future. The framework would allow federal law enforcement to verify the legitimacy of deep cover operatives without accessing the operational details that needed to remain classified. Agent Chun raised practical concerns about implementing such a framework. General Harrison, how would this system prevent actual stolen valor fraud? If we create special procedures for verifying classified service records, won't that create opportunities for people to claim their records are classified when they're actually fraudulent? The authentication would be handled by specialized units within military intelligence who have access to the actual classified records, Harrison replied. People claiming fraudulent classified service wouldn't be able to provide the authentication codes, operational references, and personal details that would be required for verification through these special channels. Over the following weeks, Santos's case became a test case for developing these new procedures. A joint task force, including representatives from the FBI, Justice Department, Department of Defense, and Congressional Intelligence Committees, worked to create protocols that would protect both national security and the integrity of criminal investigations involving veterans issues. The resolution of Santos's case required her to testify before a closed session of the House Intelligence Committee, providing details about her service record that could be verified by committee members with appropriate security clearances. The committee's verification allowed the Justice Department to formally close the stolen valor investigation without requiring Santos to reveal classified information in open proceedings. Santos was also offered the choice between maintaining the Sarah Mitchell identity permanently or transitioning to a new identity that would allow her to resume her real name while continuing to receive protection from potential retaliation by hostile intelligence services. After extensive consultation with security specialists and psychological counselors, she chose to reclaim her identity as Captain Maria Santos, accepting the ongoing security risks in exchange for the ability to live authentically. The veterans who had originally filed stolen valor complaints against Sarah Mitchell were briefed on the resolution of the case through special briefings that protected classified details while explaining why their concerns have been addressed through unusual procedures. Most of the veterans expressed understanding and respect for Santos's service once they learned the truth about her background, though some remained troubled by the secrecy that had made verification impossible through normal channels. Marcus Webb, the former Army Ranger who had first questioned Santos's background, became one of her strongest advocates within the veteran community. When I filed that complaint, I thought I was protecting the honor of military service, he said during a private meeting with Santos after the case was resolved. Now I understand that there are people who serve this country in ways that require them to sacrifice even the recognition they deserve for that service. Captain Santos deserves our respect and support, not our suspicion. The broader impact of Santos's case extended far beyond her individual situation. The legal framework developed to resolve her case became the foundation for protecting other deep cover operatives who face similar challenges during reintegration. Congressional oversight committees established new procedures for monitoring the welfare of classified personnel while protecting the operational details that needed to remain secret. The case also highlighted the psychological toll of deep cover operations and the need for enhanced support systems for operatives transitioning back to civilian life. Santos's experience led to expanded counseling programs and peer support networks that could provide assistance to operatives without compromising their security requirements. 3 years after her arrest was halted in the Denver coffee shop, Captain Maria Santos continues to work as a security consultant while maintaining her volunteer activities at the Veteran Center. Her true identity is now known to the veteran community she serves, and her experience in deep cover operations has become a valuable resource for helping other veterans deal with the challenges of reintegration and identity issues related to classified service. The tactical pen that General Harrison recognized during her arrest is now displayed in a secure exhibit at the National Security Agency headquarters, representing the dedication of operatives who serve in circumstances so sensitive that their contributions to national security can never be fully acknowledged. Santos occasionally speaks at classified briefings for military personnel who are considering deep cover assignments, sharing the real costs and consequences of service that requires sacrificing legal identity in addition to personal safety. Agent Chun was promoted to supervise a new FBI unit that specializes in investigations involving classified military service records. Her experience with the Santos case made her an expert in distinguishing between legitimate national security concerns and fraudulent attempts to use classification claims to avoid criminal prosecution. The unit has successfully resolved dozens of cases involving both actual stolen valor fraud and legitimate veterans whose service records were classified at levels that prevented normal verification. The coffee shop where Santos was arrested has become an informal memorial to the complexities of modern military service, though few of its regular customers understand the significance of what occurred there. Santos still visits Brewster's on Friday mornings, but now she sits with other veterans who know her true identity and respect the sacrifices she made in service to a country that couldn't publicly acknowledge her contributions. The story of Captain Maria Santos represents both the best and most troubling aspects of modern intelligence operations, the dedication of individuals who sacrifice everything for national security, and the systemic challenges that arise when secrecy requirements conflict with legal protections and social recognition that veterans deserve. Her case established precedents that continue to protect other operatives while ensuring that legitimate stolen valor concerns can be investigated without compromising genuine national security interests. In the end, Santos's story is not just about one woman's struggle to prove her legitimacy while protecting classified information. It's about the complex relationship between service and recognition, between security and transparency, and between individual sacrifice and collective responsibility that defines modern military service in an era where the most important contributions to national security often occur in shadows where they can never be fully acknowledged or properly honored.